joining us, everybody. Thank you for hitting record because I was just about to forget to do that, so I appreciate it. We are recording today's session. We make them available after the fact that way for people who couldn't attend but are interested in the topic. Thanks everybody for taking time out of what I'm sure is a busy Friday to join us for our webinar today, where I'm going to talk about kind of the dirty secrets about prioritization on Agile teams, although they're not really that dirty and they're not really that secret, but still. So that's what we're going to get into today. If we have not met before, let me start with some introductions. This is me. I am Dr. Patrick McConnell, Vice President of Agile Services here at Next Up. If we get a chance to chat, please just call me Pat or Patrick, because my doctorate is irrelevant to everything we're going to discuss. I've been an Agilist for a really long time, or at least a long time as far as agility goes, over a decade at this point. Most of that's actually been in the public sector, so I'm used to dealing with very thorny issues of trying to be nimble and prioritize work in a value-based kind of sense while dealing with very complicated contractor versus customer arrangements and all those kind of things. And that sums up a lot of my early Agile experience, and then what served me really well as a coach in the years since. That's also my Twitter you see on this slide, at @bowtieagility, if you want to give that a follow. I promise it's just Agile stuff. If you post anything about this webinar or us on any of the socials, we'd love it if you tagged us, #NextUpSolutions, so that we can see it. That would be great. I'm also going to introduce us. I assume you probably know Next Up Solutions. That's usually the way people have found us, by being prior students. We are also Acceleration, so these two entities under the same umbrella. Acceleration is our tech internship practice, which we are very proud of. It's actually the #2 ranked technology internship in the entire country at the moment, according to the Vault rankings that come out every year. So we're very proud of that. That's Acceleration. As for Next Up, we provide tons of fantastic world-class live taught certified Agile training, tons of Scrum Alliance credentials, Kanban University, SAFe, DevOps Institute, IC Agile, all that kind of stuff. And we are a full-service Agile coaching and collaboration partner. So helping new teams or existing teams improve Agile practices, helping enterprises plan or improve an Agile transformation that already be in flight. And of course, the third leg of that is our leadership development. So helping people grow into amazing Agile leaders that can really support and enable teams. That's really how we get the most value out of these Agile transformations. So that's what we do here at Next Up. Lots of great training, lots of great coaching. And if there's anything we can do to help you in those areas, please reach out. I would love to talk to you about it. All right. So that is it, I think, for the upfront introductions. Why don't we go ahead and get rolling with the topic that I assume you're all here to talk about. Let's talk about prioritization. So why do we build in priority order? This is a premise, a core premise of Scrum and a bunch of other Agile teaming methods too. We assume that there is some queue, some list of work that we're going to ask teams to do in short iterations. And typically that queue is ordered based on priority, typically priority based on business value or mission value, whatever is the more appropriate term for your space. And the reason we tell people to build in a prioritized order are probably for a bunch of things you would expect, like we want to confirm product vision as soon as possible. So if there's some aspect of our product vision that is risky, either technologically so or in terms of market fit or something, we want to do that stuff first so we can make sure that we're on the right track, or we can recover if it's not. That's what we want to do. We also want to do, let's see, the most valuable stuff up front as well, so that we realize value as quickly as possible. So we want to accelerate that value delivery curve. That is a kind of typical value add of what we talk about adopting Agile frameworks. Building in a prioritized fashion can also help us set expectations about product roadmap, for example, as well. And then finally, even in a situation where everything is required, where the entire backlog is mandated, we have to do it all, still makes sense to build in a prioritized order because we can't predict the future. You know, even if I've been engaged in some kind of very ironclad firm fixed price contract basis, Who knows? Maybe the government shuts down and I have to, stop the work where I'm at. If I've built in a prioritized fashion, hey, at least I've delivered the most value I could in the time that I had. So all of those are perfectly reasonable kind of justifications for building from a priority ordered queue that's oriented based on business value or mission value. But saying that is a lot easier than doing it. So where does priority come from? If you're the product owner on a Scrum team, let's say, how do you decide what's the most important thing to do next? This is a challenge for us for a bunch of reasons. First of all, we might have multiple definitions of value operating in our queue at the same time. So we know as a product owner, I'm building this product to realize outcomes for my organizations. But the outcomes might be both a revenue goal, and they could be like a user time savings goal, and they could be a reducing operations and maintenance cost kind of goal, all at the same time. So how do we prioritize when I have to compare these apples versus oranges considerations? How do I prioritize when I have a super diverse group of stakeholders who don't agree about stuff? And that is something that sometimes is a rude awakening for product owners, particularly and who are operating on Scrum teams. When people find out that part of the value of using an agile framework like Scrum is that we can change our minds a lot if we need to, they will take advantage of that. People will rappel from the ceiling on ropes to give you their idea of what is the best thing for you to do next. So you're going to need some way to figure out, how do I make choices when opinions about what to do next from important stakeholders sometimes overlap and sometimes don't. My team has their own ideas, users have their ideas. Where all of these groups agree, those are easy choices. But when they don't all overlap, now we're getting more into the weeds. The one North Star, though, that I would give you about all of this is, remember, always, 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 the people building stuff have to be the arbiter of what is and is not possible, which sometimes people will forget. You, the decision maker, the product owner, or whatever that kind of prioritizing role is, you are arbiting which to do first within the bubble of things that are possible for the team. And unfortunately, that's a thing that's easy for organizations to forget sometimes. The teams might tell us this thing is impossible, and the stakeholders are saying, but we really need it. So it doesn't matter how badly we need it if we can't do it. So we're prioritizing inside of that bubble of what is actually within the capability of our team to deliver. All right, so let's talk about methods of making choices that we might explain to people when it comes to priority. There are a ton of financial prioritization methods out there that we might use as a product owner. Things like net present value, return on investment, discounted payback period, whatever it is. Most of these measures start with some calculation of how much value do we think this particular backlog item is going to return in comparison to how much work, which translates directly to cost, is it going to take us to produce. So typically, these are all various measures of cost versus benefit, sometimes including calculations like discounting for the future value of money, inflation, things like that. I have not really used financial methods of prioritization very much, particularly at the backlog item level, for a few reasons. First of all, I find it's very difficult to come up with any justifiable estimate of how much value a particular product backlog item, some feature, is actually going to result in returning to us down the road. Because users aren't typically paying on a per feature kind of basis, even in a software context. Instead, assuming they are paying us, they're probably paying for an entire release, an entire version of software, which contains probably many features. Parsing value down to any one particular lever or button, I find, is very difficult. So that's one challenge I have. That's why one of the reasons I haven't really used financial measures very much. The other reason is because, as I mentioned, a lot of my experience coming up as a product owner and then later as a Scrum Master and Agile coach was in the public sector context. So I am used to doing work often for very large government entities who are not selling anything. So there is no economic value to realize usually as part of the work. There's no revenue that's going to come from this. Sometimes we might talk about cost savings, perhaps, but not usually how much money are we going to earn. So for those reasons, I'm not usually thinking about financial ones myself. Instead, more often, I've used non-financial measures, both because they have wider application, I think, and because I'm not guessing about very fine-grained potential value calculations down there. So I'm going to show you several very common non-financial methods of prioritization as we go through. There are tons of them. This is not in any way an exhaustive list, but just kind of a starting point for conversation. So I'm going to talk about Moscow. I'm going to talk about a risk versus value 2x2 matrix. I'm going to talk about theme screening, and then I'm going to talk about relative weighting. And then we're going to discuss some of the challenges I see with those as we go through, and just kind of keep track of whether or not as we go, you've worked with any of these or you've seen them before, and then we can talk about them at the end, maybe ask some questions. Let's start with Moscow because it's the easiest. Moscow is a phocronym, a fake acronym, MSCW, with 2 vowels thrown in just so we can pronounce it. And the letters stand for the names of 4 buckets: must have, should have, could have, and won't have. That's it. So the Moscow method of prioritization is you create these 4 buckets and then you sort things into these buckets. That's it. That's the entire method. If this works for you, cool. Don't make things any more complicated than you need to. If you can do Moscow and show it to people and they say, okay, that makes sense, great. I would never recommend adding any more process or mechanics than you need. And if that's enough for you, great. Moscow has not worked for me in a lot of environments, though, even though, it's the official method of certain Agile frameworks, especially scaling frameworks like DSDM, which I don't hear that much about anymore, but still has been around a long time. One of the problems I have with Moscow is it's rare that I have worked with an organization as a product owner or as a coach that will admit it has things outside of the must-have bucket. So we know that not everything could be a must-have, but our stakeholders maybe don't agree. So that's one challenge we have with Moscow. The other problem I have with Moscow is that it explains the choices that I've made. It shows what those choices were. It does not explain to anybody how I got to that place, how I made those choices. So I might sort things into these buckets, and I know I'm going to do all my must-haves and then as many of my should-haves as I can, and then I'll build as many of my could-haves after that if I still have time and money, but we won't do any won't-haves. But what if a stakeholder challenges me in the hallway and they say, why did you put my thing in could-have? It's a must-have to me. Well, because that's just where I put it. So if you can just make the choices and people have to be okay with them, cool. Maybe Moscow is all you need, because at least you're showing people what the choices are, but it doesn't really justify the choices. It doesn't explain how you got to those decisions. So that might be a challenge for you. Also, another limitation with Moscow is even if we can get people to agree with how we're sorting things into these buckets, it doesn't help us prioritize inside of each bucket. So, okay, which must-have should I do first? I don't know. Maybe the smallest one we could do in size order or something. I don't know. You might have to make up a rule, but Moscow doesn't come with one. So you would have to decide that or get people to agree to whatever you picked. But that's it. That is Moscow. It is not any more complicated than that. If Moscow is not enough rigor for you and the stakeholders that you have to build a consensus with, you might need something that seems a little more explicit. So instead of Moscow, maybe you do something like this. It's called risk versus value 2x2. And what you'll do is you'll sort things into 4 categories based on how you evaluate them on 2 dimensions. Is it high or low risk to complete? And is it high or low value once it's completed? Once you have sorted things into those 4 buckets, your build order would be all of the highest value, high risk stuff first, so that if any of them don't pan out, then you can move on to the next thing or something like that. But we're going to start with our highest risk, high value things. And then we will build our high value, low risk, our sure bets after that, with whatever runway we have remaining. If we still have time left, then we would build the low value, low risk stuff. We would not build high risk, low value, because there's not a lot of point. So that is risk versus value. The notion here is we want to concentrate on the highest value first, and then within that, prioritize trying the riskier things first so that we can recover with the surer bets if those risky things don't pan out. And that's that. Not too complicated. Certainly seems to help explain the choices we're making a bit better than Moscow. I can show people what the choices are, but also I can explain to somebody, well, I put your thing in the first box because I evaluated it as this and this. And as long as I'm doing that in a way that makes sense to them, great, maybe that makes sense to me as well. We could have consensus building challenges with risk versus value too. We're going to have to figure out some way to operationalize those two dimensions, risk and value, in a way that people agree with and makes sense to them. Otherwise, again, it's just kind of us appearing to just kind of fickly make choices. But a bit more rigor than Moscow. So if Moscow wasn't enough, maybe risk versus value is, and we could stop there. That still doesn't seem to work to have the conversations you need to have and build consensus and get people on board with the way you're making choices about value. Maybe we could get a little more explicit and try to get people to understand what exactly value means. And that's what we do in the next approach I'm going to talk about, which is called theme screening. As the name suggests, what we're going to do is look through a complicated product backlog, and we're going to attempt to screen things based on apparent relative value, but we're going to define value objectively based on dimensions that make sense to the work of this team and the work of this particular organization. So, for example, here is a team, they're building some product, and they know that their real goals, their actual value outcome objectives at the end of the day are to do three things: increase the amount of money that the organization earns based on sales of the application, increase their market share in the overall space of competing products. So the more people are using their tool, the better. And decrease their O&M tail, the operations and maintenance cost that the organization has to spend to keep the thing running. So everybody agrees, stakeholders agree, yes, that's at the end of the day what we need the solutions that come from this team to do for us as an organization. How we do it matters less than are we doing those three things. Cool, all right, everybody's on board. Now what we can do as the product owner is we can look through that team's product backlog, and we're going to find a baseline item. This would be some particular product backlog item that we can use as a reference. We need that baseline item to do okay on each one of these three goals. It's not nothing on any one of them. It's not everything on any one of them. It's not a slam dunk, but it's also not nothing. It does okay. It's in about whatever the middle of likely performance would be for each one of those objectives, we think. That's it. So that becomes our baseline product backlog item, whatever it is. And then we'll take the rest of our backlog items, and here I've got 2, 3, and 4, and I compare each of them one at a time to the baseline item on each of those three criteria. So if item number 2 does better than the baseline on a goal, it gets a plus. If it does worse than the baseline on a goal, it gets a minus. If it's about the same, it gets a 0. And then you score it. You give each item +1 to their score, their net score, for every plus, and -1 for every minus, and 0 for every 0. And then what we should do is build from highest score to lowest. So looking at these 4 items, the baseline plus items 2, 3, and 4, this is suggesting that item 2 should be the most important thing in our product backlog because it outperforms the baseline on all 3 of the objective goals of the work of this team. The last ranked one would be item 3, because of these 4 things, it is the worst on all of those goals. So that is theme screening. One of the things I like about this is now I can very explicitly tell my stakeholders, tell my users, tell my management if I need to, here is how I'm making choices. I am selecting for value on these 3 dimensions. Here's how they rank in the matrix. Here's how everything stacks up. And because I'm just making one-by-one comparisons, Anytime I get a new product backlog item, it's typically pretty quick for me to be able to estimate the potential value contribution of that thing compared to the baseline, figure out where it is in the ranking, and then tell somebody, what does that do to my plans? Did that bump something else out of our year? Is that likely to happen? Or is it not as good of an idea as all the other things that we need to do? So that is theme screening. Not terribly complicated. I like this for a bunch of reasons. Like I said, particularly because one, we're focused on actual end value. That's great. Two, I can explain it to people. And three, I can usually build a consensus with stakeholders. I can get people to agree up front. Yep, that team is supposed to be maximizing revenue and market share and minimizing O&M. Okay. Once I have that agreement, now I'm making choices based on that. People kind of have to be okay with that. So that's cool. Still, of course, there are some challenges here. First off, it might be hard to find a baseline item that's really in whatever the middle is of each of these three dimensions. If it's too good on any one of them, everything else looks worse by comparison, and the differences wash out, and I can't really rank anything. Or if it's too bad, everything else looks better, and then I have the same mathematics problem again. So there is that issue. Another thing, though, is that, as a product owner, especially on a Scrum team, my job is to maximize value. That doesn't just mean the most outcome. That means the most outcome for the least effort for my team. What's the smallest thing we can do that would give us the most value? And theme screening only talks about value. There is no assessment of cost or size in this. There's nothing to scale potential value against. And maybe we should do that. I mean, that to me is a perfectly reasonable thing for a product owner to try to think about all the time, cost versus benefit, even down at the product backlog item level. So theme screening doesn't really do that. It just focuses on value. If we want to do both, if we want to have some notion of value scale against some notion of size, instead of theme screening, we could use this fourth approach called relative weighting. Relative weighting works like this. I've got here three backlog items, A, B, and C. What I'm going to do is score each one from 0 to 9 on a dimension called value or benefit and a dimension called penalty. Benefit is the amount of goodness that's going to come to us as an organization from getting this thing done, whatever it is. So that's benefit. If it's the most possible benefit, that's a 9. If it's nothing, that's a 0. Penalty is the amount of badness that will happen to us if we don't do it. And that's an interesting thing to consider, because sometimes something might have basically no benefit, but a huge penalty. Like imagine some kind of information security compliance measure. Go fix this vulnerability. Well, our users are not even aware of the vulnerability. They don't care. They're not going to notice that it's fixed. But if we don't fix it, we might get in huge trouble. The organization might have all our data stolen, or our users hacked, or we get shut down by a regulating agency or something like that because we are not safe at the moment or something. Who knows? So something could have high benefit and high penalty, high on one and not the other, low on both, whatever it is. We score each of our product backlog items on those two dimensions, benefit and penalty, and then we add up the scores. That gives us a total value. We express the value as a proportion of all of the value in the matrix. So if we look at item A here, it's got a benefit of 5, a penalty of 2, so it's a total of 7 points of value. Out of 18 total points of everything, 7 plus 9 plus 2, that means item A is 39% of the possible value in my matrix right now. So that's the upside consideration. The cost consideration for us is sizing. We would get teams to size these things using a measure like relative complexity points or story points or something else that we can express more or less numerically, even though complexity points are not exactly numbers, they're really ranks, but still, we often use them a little bit like numbers. So I get the team that's going to build these things to size each one. Item A is 5 points. Out of a total of 10 points of everything, 5 plus 3 plus 2, that means item A is 50% of the possible effort or cost in my whole matrix. So that's the downside. So the upside is value, the downside is cost. I divide value percentage by cost percentage, and that gives me this number It's relative weight, it's priority score. What we would do now is we would build in prioritized order from the highest number to the lowest. So if of these three things, A, B, and C, relative weighting is saying we should do B first because its score is the highest of the three things. Now, those priority scores, I know they look like numbers and they've got decimal points in them. They're not really numbers. Item B isn't about 3 times as much value overall to us as item C. It's just more. So the numbers are really just a way to get these in rank order. So that's the mechanics of relative weighting. Figure out some way to think about total value, in this case, benefit and penalty. Divide value by size, so we're scaling benefit versus cost. And then the resulting metric we use to prioritize. We build from highest to lowest. The internal logic of relative weighting, I really like. The internal logic is, well, if two things are about the same size, of course we do the more valuable one first. But the inverse is also true. If they're about the same value, we should do the smaller one first so that we have time left to go do other things of value too. So the way a product backlog item would end up on the top of a ranking in relative weighting is to bring more value or be smaller, or ideally both. That's how you really end up on top. So that is relative weighting. Different than theme screening because it comes with its own value assessment criteria, benefit and penalty, instead of individually chosen ones. And we have this baked in comparison, this trade-off between how much benefit we might get from something, how much overall value, how much goodness, scaled against how hard it's going to be for us to accomplish. I like that. That's very economic. That's cool. You may, though, because you are a very smart audience, I know, have spotted an issue with relative weighting, though, which in a way harks back to the same problems we had with Moscow at the start of this talk, which is, what does benefit actually mean? What does penalty actually mean? Imagine some disgruntled stakeholder. Why did you score my thing, a 1 on benefit? It's a 9 to me. I don't know, it's just what I felt. There's not really anything I can dig into here and make explicit enough to explain to users. So in a way, we're kind of, even though I've done all this math and I have this grid with all these numbers, I'm kind of back to some of the same problems I had before. And that is the thing, I think, that often nobody tells you about prioritization, which is, even if you want to pick some kind of formalized method to do it, all of these methods really boil down to, because I said so, as the product owner. At the end of the day, it's you making a choice. How well they help you explain that choice, kind of variance there. So what are we going to do about this? Well, certainly, as I said earlier, don't make it any more complicated than you need to. If something like Moscow is enough, cool, just do Moscow. Or if theme screening works, great, do theme screening. Don't make it any more complicated than that. But you might need to make it more complicated. You might have a really complicated stakeholder domain. You might have a whole bunch of people that are all sort of your boss, who all have authority over you, telling you what to go do next. And if they don't agree, what are you going to do? How are you going to engineer consensus between these parties with different interests, minimal shared stake, all that kind of thing? I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. I do actually have a method that I'm going to show you. The method I'm going to show you last here, before we open things up for questions, is something I developed years and years and years back. The challenge I had was I had been brought in to coach a team of teams at a place called the National Reconnaissance Office, which is our other space agency, if you weren't aware of them. And the challenge I had was I basically needed a way for my direct customer, who was kind of at the level of colonel, to say no to people who were at the level of generals. I needed some way to build consensus around choices long enough for teams to actually finish stuff, to get to a point of value, instead of having my poor customer's head get turned all the time by people who outrank them, who are constantly derailing us before we could get to a point of meaningful release, meaningful delivery. So it's not like I'm trying to box out vision for all time, but we do need to get to some kind of a milestone before it actually makes a difference to our end users. The method that I came up with to do that is what I'm going to show you now. It takes that notion of relative weighting, of having some way of estimating the potential value return of a particular backlog item or initiative, and scaling against its potential size. So I really like that. I wanted to preserve that. But instead of those fuzzy 0 to 9 benefit and penalty things, what I did was I borrowed the logic of theme screening. Let's take those benefit and penalty scores and throw them out. Let's replace them with value-focused outcomes, objectives that actually have meaning to this particular circumstance, whatever our program is, whatever our application, all that kind of things. We get people to agree on that, and then things get a lot easier and more transparent. So here's how it works. I get my stakeholders to agree up front, what are the objective institutional goals that this team or this program is supposed to be delivering? And typically I find those by reading stuff and talking to people. You know, according to our strategic plan for the year, our goals as a department are to do these 5 things. I don't know, whatever it is. I get people to agree, yeah, that's what we're supposed to be doing. Cool. And then I frame a value assessment matrix around those goals. And then I start doing the prioritization. Every time I get a new request, we estimate value on those dimensions, we scale the value versus size, and then we can show people, here's the choice that is recommending we make. Here's what the overall choices are. Here's how we got there. So here's how this looks. Here's an example. Here is prioritization criteria we might use for, in this case, a data warehouse team. The work of this team is really to accomplish 3 objectives: to get brand new data analysis features and capabilities out in production for analysts to use. So they're serving a community of analysts in their organization who want cool analysis tools and features and all that kind of thing. The goal of this team partly is to stand up new analysis capabilities, make them available. Their goal is to reduce the overall maintenance burden of the system that they support. So right now, they get a lot of tier 2, tier 3 calls to their help desk where they have to drop what they're doing in terms of building new stuff, and go fix something that's broken because it overwhelms the capabilities of the regular help desk. So if that happened less, that would mean it would free up effort to focus into new value delivery. That's where we want to be. And then finally, the core job of this group is to get giant new packages of data out into the production environment for people to play with so that they can do their analysis jobs. Right now, every time they get a big new delivery of data, it takes a whole bunch of processing and finessing to get into a format that makes sense in this environment, which means analysts know that data exists, but they can't have it for a fairly long amount of time. They're chomping at the bit. Give it to us, give it to us, give it to us. So their goal is to speed up how quickly we get new data into production. So those are the 3 goals: speed up how quickly we can deliver new features, reduce the O&M burden, the maintenance burden that this team has to support, and speed up how quickly we can deliver new data. They would start to get some baseline ideas of how long, how many for each of those things. So right now it takes them about 6 sprints to get a new feature into production because the team gets so distracted by other things and because they have a very complicated pipeline to build and validate and deliver features. Right now, the team has to help with about 100 tier 2, tier 3 calls to their help desk every month. And right now, it takes them about 40 days to get new giant packages of data out into production, a little more than a month. So that's where we're at right now. Those are their baseline measures for each of those objectives. They would stretch out, or they would sketch out some goals. They might say, you know, if we could get new features into production in only 2 sprints, that would be amazing. That's so much faster than what we've been doing. If we got it down to a single sprint, that's our ideal goal. If we cut our help desk calls in half each month, that's amazing. If we got it down to only 10, that's probably as small as we could ever make because there's just going to be a certain amount of things that we can't ever undo, a certain amount of complexity we can't unwind. And lastly, if we cut our data delivery time down to 10 days, that's a single sprint, amazing. People would be so happy. If we got it down to same day processing, that's as fast as we could ever get. And our users would never have a lag anymore between data existing in the world and being available to them. Amazing. That's where we need to be. So that's basically step one. We sketch out these goals, we think about baselines, we think about reasonable goals and then ideal goals, and we get stakeholders to agree. Yep, that makes sense. Cool. All right, great. Now we can build an assessment matrix around this. We'll come up with a scoring method for each one of these criteria. If a new backlog item is going to speed up our speed of delivering new features by 4 sprints, that means we're only at 2 sprints to get a new feature in. Cool, that's a 10. That's an amazing improvement. If it speeds us up by only 2 sprints, that's a 5. If it speeds us up by just 1 sprint, that's a 1. If it's no change on that dimension, we'll give it a 0. And then I also often include negative scores, because sometimes something might help us on one goal but hurt us on another. Like if we buy this data appliance, that speeds up our data processing time, but it costs us a bunch more money, which hurts us on a revenue goal or a budget objective or something like that. So we might want negative capabilities in these scores as well. That helps us with apples versus oranges kinds of things. And then I walk this around. I get people to agree, yeah, that makes sense. And if they are bummed about some aspect of it, well, we can negotiate and I can change that. That's okay. Once I've got people to agree that, yeah, this makes sense, now I can actually start doing the work of prioritizing using this method. So every new request that comes in, we pretty quickly can come up with some relative comparison estimate for its benefit on these dimensions that have real meaning for the work of this team. We add up the benefit scores, we divide the value by the size, just like in typical relative weighting. That gives us this metric, this QRW score, and we build from highest to lowest, biggest score to smallest. So of these 3 items here, A, B, and C, this is telling me that based on this assessment of their value and size, we should do item C first. It's the smallest overall value. It's only 2 compared to the other 2 things, which are 5. But it's also a lot smaller than the other 2, which is how it ended up on top. Just like regular relative weighting, the QRW scores here are not real numbers. They're really just a ranking tool. So items A and C aren't necessarily twice as good for us to do as item B. They're just more. So how does this solve problems for us? What it does is it lets us pre-negotiate a consensus up front around what is it we're trying to do. And then when we start making choices based on that, people kind of have to be okay with that because they agreed up front, yes, we are supposed to be prioritizing delivering revenue and delivering market share, whatever the goals are. That means later when I have to tell some stakeholder, not now, we can't do that thing right now, this sprint or this release, or maybe not even this contract year, that creates space for that. They kind of have to be okay with that. As long as we are making reasonable guesses about value assessment, we're prioritizing the right things, they kind of have to be okay with that. If we're not, we can modify the matrix. That's okay. And then the third thing that this really does for us, why I like this approach, is it emphasizes doing smaller things over bigger things. So if you bring a request to my team and you end up kind of low in the matrix, if there's some way you can restate your needs so that it gets smaller, but it still brings a similar amount of value, your relative score just shot up. You just got a lot higher in the ranking. Also, for big efforts, like if they're going to take more than a sprint, like these are maybe release level goals, that might mean that as we're building something and we're getting closer to finishing it, its potential value stays about the same, but its size, its remaining effort to get done keeps getting smaller, which means its relative weight score keeps getting bigger, which means it's easier and easier for us to finish stuff instead of constantly starting and getting distracted from finishing. So that's really, really powerful often in organizations, particularly the organizations that are kind of spread in many places, trying to do many things at the same time. So that's it in a nutshell. That's QRW, quantified relative weighting. That's also relative weighting, classic relative weighting, plus theme screening and risk 2x2 and Moscow as well. What I'd like to do now is show you the very first one of these QRW things that I ever built for an organization, all the way back at the NRO. In this case, I built it way back in 2013. It's hard to believe that's a long time ago. It's like almost 9 years ago at this point. And here we go. I know the type is really small in this Excel sheet. Don't worry about it. You don't really need to know the words here. But what we have is this is the prioritization dashboard that we used to use to make choices across 3 teams building in 2-week sprints with a very complicated set of stakeholders who all basically outranked my direct customer who was making priority choices at the program level across these 3 teams. I walked around and got people to agree in their organization that we were going to make choices based on 10 value criteria. And that's what you see along the tier at the top. 5 value to enterprise criteria and 5 value to program criteria. Now, the value to enterprise criteria in this case were ones that we talked about all over the place. These were the very public things that we would discuss with anybody. So things like future budget impact, how much money is it going to save a year in terms of things like licensing cost, things like that. User effort, which was end user time savings. Did it make the system more stable? Did it make it break less, for example? Did it make the system more secure? Did it make the system easier to scale because we constantly were adding more systems to use our solutions as clients? We also had these other 5 value to program criteria, which were more internal considerations, like, did this increase the strategic position of our systems relative to others? Or is this effort largely duplicative and it's really hard for us to explain why we aren't doing something that other systems already do? What other efforts depend on something finishing before they can start, or is it vice versa? How likely are people to see this as a benefit and know that we did it, because that helps with internal politics? Compliance requirements, is this a thing we have to do within a certain amount of time frame or else we lose our authority to operate? And then one of the most important things internally was this one, budget contributor. If this request came from outside of our program, did they offer to give us money to get it done? If so, they get a higher score. Did they already give us money to get it done? Well, then we absolutely have to do that thing this contract year, or that's fraud. So anyway, there you go. Once we got these scorings up and running, people agreed to them, and that seemed to work out well. I'll collapse the actual ranks here. You can see how this works. Every time we got a new request, whatever this particular thing was, we could pretty quickly get people to agree about their size estimates, whatever it was. We would pretty quickly get a team to just take a rough guess. How many points was that thing to build? And that was team specific, by the way. We aren't making the mistake of thinking that complexity points estimates mean the same thing from one team to another. So this is entirely internal to the team that was going to build it. And we divide value by size, and that gives us this relative weight score. Fairly straightforward. Now, this also let me do another thing that's fairly powerful. So this number here, this number 65, that is, as of the apparent date of the spreadsheet, that team's current recent average velocity. So that team lately has been doing about 65 points a sprint, whatever points mean on that team. Based on the number of sprints left in that contract year, that's how much capacity they had left as of that day. This final number is the sum of all of these things. How many points were in the matrix? The more points there were, the less likely we were going to get all that stuff done. If this number is bigger than 653, most of these things are not happening. So that was a way to level set how much capacity do we have. And then you can see here in the spreadsheet, certain rows are highlighted green. What I'm doing here is I'm just by calculation highlighting all of the rows rather, in relative weight order that we think will fit into this number as of right now. And as we get closer to the end of the year, when there's less and less capacity, less and less rows are highlighted green because there's less year left. So that was a very powerful tool. Not only were we prioritizing in a way that people could understand and say yes to, that also meant that pretty quickly, anytime we got a new request, I could tell my customers, is that going to happen this contract year or not? If it is, what did it push out of the year? Because there's only so much space. So if this comes in a new place and it forces some things down, what fell out of the capacity that we have left? And it wouldn't take us weeks and weeks to come up with those guesses. We could do this in a day or two every time we got a big new direction. All we need are reasonable guesses about value and a reasonable guess about size, and then we're off to the races. So this is the very first one I ever did. way back then. I've done a bunch more since then. In fact, sometimes I've been hired as a coach expressly to just do this for an organization, help them set this up. Here are some lessons I've learned in the interim. 10 value criteria, that's kind of too many. Don't have that many. 5 is a good number. 8 is probably the most I would ever have. 2 or 3 is maybe the low end. The problem with 10, with a lot, is that it's really easy for everything to score a 1 here or there on a couple of things, but not really be a slam dunk anywhere. And then the differences kind of wash out. So, somewhere between 3 and 8, and I usually use 5, is a good number because that's enough to show some difference, but it's not so many possibilities in terms of value that the differences all wash out. So that's useful. Also, not everything has to be on the same scoring scale. This first one I did, everything went from 10 to -10. In the years since, I realized sometimes I don't need negative numbers. Something might just be a 10 or 0. It might be binary. I don't have to have everything scored on a linear scale. Like it might be on time sometimes. For a security compliance issue, a lot of the times what I've done is scored it based on how long do we have to get that done? Sometime this year, maybe that's 1 point. Sometime in the next month, maybe that's plus 50 points to make sure that is the most important thing we do next. So we don't, get shut down or whatever it is. I have also sometimes used these scorings to make a point to the organization as well. For example, I once was brought in to help an organization set this up across a bundle of teams. They had 18 teams operating kind of a safe structure. And one of the problems they were having was, if you have any familiarity with SAFe, know that a common thing you do in SAFe is all the teams that are nesting together in what's called a release train come together once every 3 months to plan their next what's called a program increment. So they have this 2-day thing called a PI planning event where they're all supposed to work together to come up with a reasonable plan for the next 3 months across all of these interdependent teams. And one thing I noticed right away was the organization was having an issue where teams were committing to do work in a 3-month period that would require getting new servers, new infrastructure. That organization, the way their infrastructure process worked was it would take them often 6 to 9 months to buy a new server. So I was asking them, why are you committing to do work in the next 3 months if you might not have the hardware for at least 6? And their answer would be, because we have to get that done. And I would say, well, but you can't. Like, if you fall off a bridge, you have to fly. It doesn't mean you can, no matter how badly you need to. And they said, yeah, I know, but we have to. And I said, well, what if here, let me do a thing. So I added a new criteria to their matrix that said, do we have the servers to perform this work? If yes, plus 100 points. Do we not have the servers? Minus 100 points. And almost everything else was on a scale of 10 to -10. Hopefully ensuring that there's no way for something we can't physically do to float up to the top of the framework and look like it's the most important thing. Teams love that. Stakeholders actually got really mad at me in that particular organization about that. But we have to do this thing. But you can't. But we have to. Anyway, I did eventually, I think, prevail there. But so that is more or less that in terms of my talk. What I want to do now is take about 10 minutes and open it up for questions. So if you want to type them in the chat or use the raise hand function, I will just call on people for about the next 10 minutes and let me know what we can talk about. Any questions about this at all or aspects of it you want to discuss? Naaman, go ahead.
Yeah, so in this 2x2 matrix, which you shared earlier for risk versus value, right? Mm-hmm. So the question which I was having is that, like, probably is that with low risk and high value, that was the second quadrant in your slide. I was thinking that should be the topmost item to start with, mm-hmm. Or yeah, exactly this slide here. Yeah. So I was thinking that low risk and high value shouldn't be that item should be done first to begin with.
And that's, you could make an argument for that. That's kind of like the low-hanging fruit approach. Let's do all the
Yeah.
least stuff to realize the most value first. The notion here a lot is that we need probably all of the high value stuff. And so I want to tease out which bets that I'm not sure of are going to work early on. If we try one of the high risk things and it doesn't work, what that might mean is we just move on to the next high risk thing and it goes back in the backlog, or we realize it's not possible or something. But the logic here is that if we need to do pretty much all of the high value stuff, I want to start with my least sure bets so that I can then prioritize how much runway I have left afterwards. If that logic doesn't make sense for your organization and you want to do the other way around, that's certainly okay.
Sure.
Also, those are often the things where if we don't do them, they are also risks to the overall effort. Yeah. So what matters less is, this is usually the way this is explained, the way these boxes are laid out, 1, 2, 3, and avoid. If that doesn't make as much sense for your organization, you want to go first high value, low risk, and then high value, high risk. Okay, what matters more is that whatever you're picking makes sense to you and your stakeholders. Does that help?
Sure. Thank you.
All right, other questions? Suleiman, go ahead.
Yes, Patrick, thank you very much. For theme screening, when you're putting the baseline, how does that work when you're doing the QRW? What's the baseline over there?
So in QRW, there's no baseline. Everything is being compared collectively along the same criteria at the same time, instead of these one-by-one comparisons, everything against a baseline, which is what you do in theme screening.
So my second question would be, how do you get consensus from the team if you don't have a baseline?
So what you would need to do is you put something together and propose it. So that's another bit of advice I would give folks for theme screening. Here, let me share my screen again. Don't start with an empty matrix and ask stakeholders, all right, how should we score stuff? Instead, use your best judgment and guess, and then walk the guess around and get feedback on it, because it's easier for people to agree to that. But you're going to have to understand the context that you're in. You're going to have to understand what is value supposed to mean here. And speak to people in the language that they will hear to build consensus around the choices that you think make the most sense. You might have to revise it, but it's definitely easier to start with something than get people's reaction than it is to just start from a blank slate. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. All right, we had a question in the chat here from Tayaba. In theme screening, when item 2 is ranked highest and item 5 came up, will the baseline become item 2? No, so the baseline would be, in general, kind of a perpetual thing that we're always looking at, whatever it is. So the baseline we would keep the same. If we change the baseline in theme screening, you would have to go back and reassess all of your comparisons, which you could do if you wanted to, but you would have to each time if you change the baseline. That might mean that the baseline is something we did a while ago. Like, okay, remember that thing we did last year? Is this new item more than less, or something like that? But yeah, that's the logic there. The baseline stays the same. We have a question in the chat here. Would it be okay to share this recording with product owners, or we're sharing in class and asking them to sign up be preferred? Absolutely, you can share the recording around. You can, we'll make it a public link. That's certainly okay. And then if that spurs conversation and you need help having those conversations, by all means, reach out. Let's see, other questions. All right, Suleiman again.
So yes, would you recommend to make it like the QRW as like a fixed template to use like in several other approaches when you're doing like different programs or consulting for different organization? Or no, you would make it specific for each one?
So what I would say is it should be specific. If all of those, let's say if you're supporting product ownership or prioritization, or you're coaching across a bunch of teams, that are all within the same organization that would make sense for them to have the same value outcomes, sure, that could be fine. But the real strength of this approach is that these things should have meaning to the people in that context, which probably means that in different contexts, we would need to use different measures.
And which means you have different score values and different evaluations, correct?
Yep, I probably end up setting different ones for different contexts. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Amala asks in the chat, in relative weighting, what's the logic of adding benefit to penalty versus subtracting penalty from benefit? So the notion here is, if we get the thing done, we are avoiding the penalty, which is why we can add them. If we don't get the thing done, we're going to end up eating the penalty. That's why that is. Any other questions? Yeah, again, I know quantified relative weighting looks fairly complicated, and it kind of is. I wouldn't jump straight to that if you don't need to. By all means, do the lightest weight thing that is the easiest to explain and talk about that you can get away with. But if you need more complexity to help organize very complicated domains, then that's one method that I've used. All right. Well, with that, why don't I go ahead and show the closing slides here, and then if anybody has any remaining questions, I can stick around for a little bit. This is my contact info. Again, I'm Dr. Patrick McConnell. I'm also the Vice President of Agile Services here at Next Up, which means in addition to providing lots of training, I also lead our coaching and consultancy practice. That is my work email and phone there. Again, my Twitter is Bowtie Agility, and it's Agile stuff only, I promise. You won't see me yelling at an airline about luggage or anything, just Agile stuff. And if you do LinkedIn, please reach out and connect. I have a very large network on LinkedIn, especially of Agilists. We will also happily in a post webinar email give you a link you can use there, you see on the screen, to book a follow-up consultation. If you want to talk about coaching, you're consulting, you've got training questions, things like that, by all means, reach out. We are always happy to assist folks any way we can. Also, please give Next Up a follow on all of the socials, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, what have you. We post all sorts of useful things, including fantastic blog articles and free webinars like this that are both informative and that you can use to claim great free Scrum education units or professional development units to maintain credentials, things like that, and they can just be really useful to you. With that, that is the end of my presentation. So by all means, stick around if you got a question. Otherwise, thanks for coming, everybody. I really appreciate you joining us, and I hope this is useful to you. If there's anything else that I or Next Up can do to help you, please just reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. I did have one last quick question.
Go ahead.
So your slide deck that you have are you going to share that with us so we can like share it with our POs?
Yes. So we'll make a PDF available.
Okay.
In the follow-up link. Yep.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.